Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are having another discussion about Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. If you've been paying attention to the channel lately, you may have noticed I've been talking a little bit more about Metroid Prime 4 than usual, and that's because I think we are very close to Nintendo showing us a lot more about this game. It's been widely reported that a Nintendo Direct is to be happening soon. I agree, I think it's very likely. And in this Direct, I am expecting, as I've talked about in prior videos, to get a release date trailer for Metroid Prime 4, and I believe this release date will be, as I've talked about in prior videos, either at the very end of October, the last week of October, or the very beginning of November. And I've gone into all the reasonings as to why I believe this and all that stuff in prior videos. What I want to focus on here, though, is how I believe, during the span of time between this Nintendo Direct we're supposedly going to get very soon, in just a few short days, and when Metroid Prime 4 comes out, which I think will be either at the end of October or the beginning of November, there will be a big marketing campaign where Nintendo will be absolutely pushing Metroid Prime 4 hard, very similar to how Nintendo pushed Tears of the Kingdom right before release, 6 weeks before release, or Donkey Kong Bonanza 4 weeks before its release, which we've also talked about before. But during the span of time, we're going to learn so much about this game, and we're going to learn about Metroid Prime 4's big hook, its big draw that will bring in an expanded audience to Metroid Prime 4. Not here trying to argue that Metroid Prime 4 is going to sell 30 million copies, although I would love to see that happen, but I do believe this is a huge opportunity for Metroid to reach a new audience, and I do believe Nintendo is very much aware of that. Especially after making such a huge investment on this game, working on it for such a long time, they want to make sure this game succeeds. And what I find so interesting about this, being on the precipice of this big Metroid Prime 4 news blowout, I think the big draw, the big secret of Metroid Prime 4, has actually been hidden in plain sight all this time. And so I want to dive further into this big secret of Metroid Prime 4, how it could benefit this game, and what it may mean for both the gameplay and the story. So we have a decent amount to get into this time. But if you do find yourself enjoying my videos, I would like to remind you all to consider subscribing. I talk about Nintendo news, rumors, and theories on a near daily basis. I would appreciate it. So yesterday, my mind really started to churn about Metroid Prime 4 because I made an interesting connection, which I talked a little bit about in yesterday's video towards the end. I realized that some comments made by Special Nick of the Xbox Era podcast seem to have aged relatively well. So for those that don't know, Special Nick is someone who has been known to hear things here and there, and he has gotten some very interesting things correct, such as all of the launch details for Nintendo Switch 2. It appears he's very well connected. And so with this in mind, I look back to what he said a couple years ago about Metroid Prime 4, and you can check out the entire podcast and the whole clip I'm referring to. It will be linked in the description below. But to briefly paraphrase here, a couple of things he said he heard about the game back then is that Metroid Prime 4 will have some regions that are massive, and that it almost reminds you of Halo Infinite, which is an open world game. And it's not to say that this game is open world, for the record, just that there are some big, vast areas, large in scope. And then I also think about comments made by friend of the channel Kiwi Talks, who is well connected because he does many interviews with different developers in the industry, including developers who have worked on Metroid. His channel will be linked in the description below, and also be providing a link to a podcast that I took part of on Nintendo Prime's channel where Kiwi Talks talk a little bit about this. And to paraphrase him, he's talked about how there will be more expansive areas, and how Nintendo is still keeping their cards close to their chest when it comes to Metroid Prime 4. But I think they're going to show their hand with Metroid Prime 4 very soon, as we've talked about already. And I think a big part of this hand is something that's actually been hidden in plain sight for several months already, that Nintendo's actually been teasing with the very key art of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond that they showed to us back on March 27th of 2025 earlier this year. And so I bring you to this key art of Samus Aran and various things behind her. We have the Lemorin and these statues, and we have the Metroid Prime 4 logo, but I think the really interesting stuff is at the bottom, this entire vast desert. And I certainly talked about this before, But when you take into consideration the comments made by both Special Nick and Kiwi Talks, and how this is something unlike anything else we've seen in the game, and it has some clear, interesting, unique points of interest, I think this is actually something in the game. I think this is actually a vast area that we could explore. It could be one of the vast areas or expansive regions that we've heard about, and this might be our big clue to a big secret of Metroid Prime 4. You look at the gameplay we've seen so far of Metroid Prime 4. We have the battle taking place on planet Tanamar, the beginning few minutes of the game. And then we have the opening moments of Vuros. Neither of these areas show off anything quite like this desert. And so ultimately what I'm getting at here is that I think one of the big hooks of Metroid Prime 4 is that it is a massive, epic adventure that is wide in scope with many amazing areas to explore. There will be areas that look expansive, and I think this is going to be the thing that will bring in a larger audience to Metroid Prime 4. Because the fact of the matter is this: big, sprawling, open adventures bring in a large audience. That's why there are people who feel like open world games are overdone. But let me be crystal clear here. I do not believe Metroid Prime 4 is going to be an open world game. I don't think that type of structure is most suited for Metroid, at least as we understand the series so far. But I also think people misinterpret what open world is. Open world has been used to describe just games that have big areas to explore, and that's not quite right. Open world is more so about gameplay structure and being able to do things and go anywhere you want, however you please, with minimal restriction. So think about games like Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto. Once you get through the opening moments, you can pretty much go anywhere you want. That's not how Metroidvanias work or how the Metroid Prime series works. There is a big world to explore and things to find, but you are limited by your abilities. And so you have to find a way to push forward, unlocking abilities, unraveling this puzzle that is the overall world. And so I assume Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, especially based off what we have seen so far, will be mostly something along these lines. But that doesn't mean they can't have wide, expansive areas still. And we've actually seen some very interesting animations with Samus. We've noted a lot of interesting things. For example, she can do some quick dashes in the air. That does seem to show that there will be faster gameplay here, and perhaps you will expand on that as you progress throughout the game. But we've also seen some extended animations where Samus is running around in third person. It's still brief, but we can see there's a lot of detail being put into here, and it's pretty easy to envision them bringing in other abilities from prior Prime games, such as the Speed Booster. And perhaps even later into the game they could introduce something like the Screw Attack. Abilities like these could give Samus a lot more options in exploring vaster, wider areas, and doing so with more speed. If you have a vast desert, how would you go about crossing it? Would you just be walking across a vast distance, or could they allow you to use something like the Speed Booster where you can be blitzing around all these sands and even doing some wide drifting turns to make things a little bit more interesting? I think something like that could be in the cards here. And to be clear, I'm talking about this desert because that's what we see from the key art, but perhaps there could be other expansive areas. But I do think if you have something like a wide desert, something like that would be pretty easy to pull off on Switch 1 while still maintaining 60 frames per second, or rather, maybe easy is the wrong word, more feasible. So maybe this desert is the most expansive area in the game, but there could still be other areas that are wide in scope. And so I think there's a good chance that Nintendo will show off a lot of this open expansiveness of Metroid Prime 4, really appealing to the gamer that likes adventure, because Metroid is an adventure game, and so they're going to show that really well. And that's what's going to really bring in more of that audience that's into playing big Zelda games, for example, because they're big adventures. Except this one's going to be more of an exotic sci-fi adventure. While I do think the whole open world hook does help games to sell to the masses, I think a big part of that is just the appeal to this sense of adventure. And so we look at other games that have come out throughout the Switch era that have seen a greater level of success. We look at games like Super Mario Odyssey, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, even the more recent Donkey Kong Bonanza, these games appealed to a larger audience than prior entries. We haven't seen the overall sales numbers for Bonanza, but it does seem to be off to a promising start. And these aren't open world games, but they are adventures that are more grand in scope than prior entries, and that brought in a larger audience. I think the same could happen with Metroid Prime 4, and I think Nintendo's very much aware of that. But talking more about this desert area here, I think there are some very interesting elements. So we have this building to the left. This building to the left looks a lot like buildings you've seen from the Federation in the opening segments of the game. The only real difference I'm noticing is that there's not as many of those buildings, and there seems to be some sort of tattered flag. Perhaps there are even some members of the Federation force hanging out here, and this flag is meant to be a bit of a Federation beacon or sign so others can find their way. Perhaps there's some sort of side questing involved with finding Federation troopers or what have you throughout the world of Metroid, and maybe they end up here or something. Or not, because Metroid does deal a lot in isolation, and perhaps they don't want you hanging out with too many people throughout the game. That doesn't mean there can't be the occasional character here and there, though. But another interesting point on this map is this really weird looking alien structure that clearly looks more advanced than what's over here. This might be related to the Lemorne, although from what we've seen of the architecture of the Lemorne in the Welcome to Vuros trailer, it doesn't look quite the same, so it could be something else, or it could just be that we haven't seen everything of what the Lemorne have to offer. After all, we do see these futuristic looking soldiers here that may also be related to the Lemorne, so maybe it is all connected. But something I keep coming back to is how we've seen a lot of Federation Force technology throughout the world of Vuros. Like, we see this mech here ensnared in all these branches and vines. Or how we also see this piece of equipment that seems to be in a similar scenario here. At first I thought maybe they were stuck here for a very long time, but maybe they all simply just appeared there. Because we see at the end of the treehouse, the end of that opening segment of Metroid Prime 4, Sylux activates the artifact, and it causes some sort of giant flash. And what happens next is that we see Samus suddenly is on this planet of Vuros as opposed to planet Tanamar that looks completely different, but there's also a lot of Federation Force technology thrown into a whole bunch of vines. But then we also have the key art where we have this desert, and there's also a Federation Force facility of some kind, it looks like, there as well. I think something interesting about Metroid Prime 4 is that the literal logo is of the shape of a black hole, and the artifact is in the exact shape, and we even see a flash here like a portal. And it's been theorized that black holes are like the entrances to portals that take you through a wormhole and out a white hole. It's a whole sort of like tunnel thing. And literally the name of Metroid Prime 4 is Beyond. What is the Beyond? Does it tie into these black hole portals? Does it go beyond that? Pun not intended there. I speculated that there could maybe even be some time travel involved here. Like, if we're talking about a vast desert, that comes with the implication that there is a history here where perhaps there was an ocean once. I think it's worth noting that the opening text of Metroid Prime 4 says this game takes place in Cosmic Year 20X9, but looking at the other introductions to the prior Metroid Prime games, in the very beginning, they don't mention when these games take place. Not in the very beginning. And so maybe there's a little bit of an extra emphasis being placed on the time in which that opening segment takes place, because perhaps there is some time travel involved here with the artifact, this portal, going beyond and showing up elsewhere, and perhaps even tying into this desert we see in the key art. And what I find really interesting about what we're talking about here is that it matches up really well to what Kensuke Tanabe talked about in regards to Metroid Prime 4 a decade ago. So there was an interview from back in 2015 where the Metroid Prime producer Kensuke Tanabe talked about what he would want to do with a future game. And here Tanabe says, instead of broadening it to more planets, I would have one and would focus on the timeline and being able to change that. So we have black holes that are portals, not necessarily to a different place in space, but perhaps also in time, We see a desert, we see a focus on the cosmic calendar. There could be something going on here. And while you might say, well, that interview is from so many years ago, Tanabe also talked about in this same interview wanting to do with something with Silex. So, that Silex part has been confirmed. Perhaps Tanabe has been very much aware of what he's wanted to do with Metroid Prime 4 for a very long time. And we're finally going to start to see his vision. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.